You're standing on a frozen road in the northern reaches of a country whose borders shift with the centuries, and time doesn't matter because cold operates by its own laws. You pull off your glove to adjust a strap or check a map, and when you look down at your fingers, something is wrong. The skin appears waxy, almost yellowish white, and when you press one fingertip against another, you barely feel the contact. The searing ache that plagued you an hour ago has disappeared, and that silence is precisely what should terrify you. Your body is reporting that nothing is wrong at the exact moment when everything is going wrong, and you don't have a hospital within 100 miles, no ambulance to summon, no physician waiting with warmed fluids and clinical protocols. The question is immediate and brutal. What do you do now, in this moment, with only the knowledge passed down through generations and whatever materials you can find in your pack or in this wilderness? And here's the mystery that drove this entire investigation. Why did some people who faced this exact situation walk away with all their fingers and toes, while others lost them after doing precisely what everyone around them swore was the correct and proven treatment? The deception of frostbite begins with that dangerous silence, with the numbness that feels like relief after the burning ache of intense cold. Throughout history, from mountain villages in the Alps to Siberian postal routes to whaling ships locked in Arctic pack ice, people encountered frostbite regularly enough to develop treatments, rituals, and firm beliefs about what worked. The problem is that frostbite operates on a timeline that conceals its damage. When tissue freezes, ice crystals form between cells, pulling water out of cellular structures and collapsing the delicate architecture that keeps flesh viable. The affected area progresses through visible stages, first the redness and sting of cold exposure, then the pale or greyish-yellow waxy appearance as blood retreats from the surface, then the wooden hardness of genuinely frozen tissue. What people couldn't perceive, and what modern research eventually clarified, was that the moment of freezing frequently didn't determine survival. The tissue existed in a strange suspended state where it could still be saved or could still be destroyed, and the deciding factor often arrived not from the cold itself, but from what happened during attempted rescue. Survivors who recorded their experiences, soldiers who filled military medical logs, and expedition members who maintained diaries all described the same sequence. A person notices something wrong, panic rises, and someone steps forward to offer help. That help, delivered with absolute confidence and genuine concern, could quietly finish what the cold had started. The logic people followed made complete sense on the surface. If tissue is cold, warm it. If circulation has halted, get the blood moving again. If the skin looks pale and lifeless, rub it until color returns. This reasoning produced practices that spread across cultures and centuries, from ancient Rome to Renaissance Europe to 19th century frontier settlements, and the most notorious of these was rubbing frozen flesh with snow. The theory appeared, sound snow would gradually raise temperature without shocking the tissue with sudden heat, and friction would stimulate blood flow back to the surface. Countless travelers did exactly this, scrubbing handfuls of snow against numb cheeks, frozen ears, and whitened fingers. What they couldn't possibly know was that ice crystals already in the tissue were functioning like microscopic blades, and adding friction on top of that damage was shredding cells that might still have been salvageable. The rubbing didn't restore circulation. It destroyed structures that had been suspended in a delicate holding pattern. Military records from Napoleonic campaigns, expedition accounts from polar ventures, and folk medicine traditions across northern regions all mention snow rubbing as standard practice, which means generations of people were taught to perform something nearly guaranteed to worsen frostbite damage. The same destructive impulse extended to vigorous massage, slapping, forceful flexion of frozen joints, and even beating sensation back into numb limbs. People wanted visible action, wanted to fight the cold with energy and effort, and that instinct for aggressive intervention proved catastrophic. Equally dangerous was the compulsion to seek intense heat as rapidly as possible. Picture a hunting party returning to a cabin after hours in sub-zero conditions, and the man with frost-damaged hands thrusts them directly toward the fire or plunges them into the hottest water available. The rush of warmth flooding back felt like healing, like triumph over the cold, but what was actually happening inside that tissue told a different story. Frozen cells heated unevenly, with surface tissue warming faster than deeper layers, creating temperature gradients that stressed already compromised structures. The return of blood flow to tissue that couldn't yet handle it triggered inflammatory cascades, and cells that had been in a fragile, suspended state suddenly died in waves. Expedition journals describe this pattern with heartbreaking regularity. A person seems to recover by the fire, sensation returns, hope rises, but over the following days the damage emerges as blisters, blackened skin, and ultimately tissue death that might not have occurred under gentler treatment. Then there was alcohol, that other false friend of frostbite victims. A flask of brandy or vodka offered psychological comfort and the sensation of internal warmth, but it dilated blood vessels near the skin's surface, accelerating heat loss from the core while creating a dangerous illusion of recovery. People drank to get warm and became colder, their judgment impaired precisely when critical decisions demanded clarity about shelter, movement, and care. But here's where the story becomes genuinely interesting. Not everyone got it catastrophically wrong. Scattered throughout the historical record, from Inuit communities in the high Arctic to experienced alpine guides to certain military units that absorbed harsh lessons across brutal campaigns, there were practices that actually helped people survive with their limbs intact. These weren't magic or mysterious intuition. They were careful observation translated into rules that happened to align with what frozen tissue genuinely needs. The common thread was restraint, a counterintuitive refusal to attack the frozen part directly. Some communities wrapped frostbitten extremities loosely in dry fur or wool, protecting them from further cold and from friction, but made no attempt to warm them rapidly. They focused instead on stabilizing the person's core temperature, warming the torso, providing hot drinks, blocking wind, trusting that the body would gradually address the extremities once it wasn't fighting for overall survival. Experienced mountain travelers understood that removing boots from frozen feet was dangerous, unless you were absolutely certain you wouldn't need to walk again, because a frozen foot could sometimes still bear weight, but a thawed foot that subsequently refroze was catastrophically worse than one that had never thawed at all. This points to one of the most critical and least intuitive principles that emerged from centuries of accumulated experience. Rewarming is only beneficial if you can keep the person warm afterward. Refreezing after a thaw is dramatically more destructive than remaining frozen, because the initial thaw triggers inflammatory processes that refreezing then amplifies with devastating and irreversible effect. Consider a scenario that played out in countless variations across the historical record. A group of travelers or soldiers is pinned down by a storm in inadequate shelter, and one of them clearly has frostbitten feet. They possess the capability to warm him, perhaps with heated stones wrapped in cloth or a fire they've managed to sustain, but the storm shows no sign of breaking, and if it suddenly lifts, they'll need to move quickly or die where they stand. Do they thaw his feet now, knowing that walking on thawed, frostbitten tissue will shred what remains, and knowing that if the cold catches them again, his feet will refreeze into an even more damaged state? Or do they keep him frozen, maintaining the tissue in that suspended condition where it might still be saved later, and gamble that they can reach proper shelter before the damage becomes irreversible? Expedition accounts suggest that experienced leaders often chose to delay warming, a decision that seemed cruel in the moment, but reflected hard-won wisdom about how frostbite actually progresses. The delay wasn't abandonment, it was purchasing time by keeping tissue in a state where further harm was minimized. When warming was finally attempted, the more successful approaches involved gradual exposure to moderate heat water that felt warm to the touch but not hot, careful wrapping near body heat without direct fire exposure, and patience, measured in hours rather than desperate minutes. Some traditions employed warmed oils or animal fats, not as medicines but as protective barriers against moisture and wind, while damaged skin slowly began healing. There are accounts of frost-damaged hands being wrapped gently and then placed against the torso of an uninjured companion, using body heat as a consistent warming source that couldn't accidentally overshoot into dangerous temperatures the way flames or boiling water could. The social dynamics of frostbite treatment added another dimension of complexity, because decisions about care often weren't made by the victim alone. In military camps, aboard ships, in mountain villages bound by collective survival, who decided how a frozen limb should be treated? Accounts from military medical officers reveal constant tension between what trained physicians recommended and what soldiers practiced among themselves, with snow rubbing persisting in certain units long after army manuals had discouraged it. Ships maintained their own hierarchies of knowledge, with experienced sailors sometimes overruling ship surgeons based on what they'd personally observed work in previous voyages through Arctic waters. Village communities passed practices down through generations, and breaking from tradition required either extraordinary evidence or extraordinary tragedy. There are records of communities changing their approach only after particularly devastating winters, when conventional methods produced enough amputations and deaths that even the most traditional elders accepted the need for new protocols. Prevention blurred seamlessly into treatment in these environments. Experienced groups understood that frostbite was far easier to prevent than to cure, and elaborate systems emerged for mutual monitoring and early intervention. Sailors on night watch were checked by companions at regular intervals, observers scanning for the telltale pale patches on ears and cheeks that indicated early frostbite before numbness masked the victim's own awareness. Travelers moving in convoy called warnings to each other across the wind, and strict collective rules about wet clothing, overly tight boots, and exposed skin were enforced rigorously because one person's frostbite endangered everyone's pace and survival. The materials people relied upon reveal another dimension of practical knowledge developed through accumulated suffering and observation. Wool maintained its insulating properties when wet in ways that cotton and linen could not, and communities in cold climates gravitated toward wool and fur not by coincidence but through generations of observed survival outcomes. Oils and animal fat served as wind barriers and moisture repellents, protecting healing skin from continuous environmental assault. Dry wrappings mattered enormously because moisture accelerated heat loss and created conditions where tissue damage deepened rather than stabilized. Heated stones or containers of warm water provided controlled heat sources that couldn't suddenly flare to dangerous temperatures the way open flames could, and there are accounts of these objects being wrapped carefully in cloth and rotated regularly to maintain consistent, gentle warmth over extended periods. The absence of antibiotics meant that infection remained an omnipresent threat lurking behind every case of frostbite, and many victims who survived the initial cold and the rewarming died weeks later when gangrene claimed damaged tissue. People developed various methods for keeping wounds clean, with inconsistent success. Some applied honey or wine as antiseptics, others relied on careful drying and protection from contamination, and outcomes remained tragically unpredictable. The emotional reality of frostbite care in these settings demands acknowledgement. People watched companions, family members, and fellow travelers suffer slow tissue death even after the immediate danger had passed, knowing that their treatment choices in those critical early hours might have determined everything. What emerges from this investigation is not a simple story of folk superstition eventually defeated by clinical science. The reality is more complicated and more profoundly human than that. Across centuries and continents, people confronting frostbite were attempting to solve a desperate problem with whatever information they possessed, and their successes and failures created a body of practical knowledge that was partially correct, partially destructive, and always incomplete. The practices that endured those handed down from one generation to the next, from experienced guide to novice traveler, from veteran sailor to trembling new crew member, persisted because they appeared to work at least some of the time, and because alternatives hadn't proven obviously superior. The tragedy is that some practices which seemed effective were actually causing hidden damage obscured beneath natural variation in outcomes, while other practices that felt frustratingly passive were quietly protecting tissue that aggressive intervention would have destroyed. Frostbite care was never folk magic versus scientific medicine. It was generations of careful observation battling against myths that felt entirely logical but punished the body at a cellular level no one could see. The people who got it right weren't blessed with special insight. They were careful observers who noticed patterns, questioned traditions when casualties mounted, and possessed the rare combination of experience and humility to recognize that doing less might accomplish more. The cold teaches the same lesson, whether the year is 1720 or 1920. The body operates on its own timeline for damage and recovery, and the most valuable help often comes from those wise enough to protect that process rather than override it with desperate action.